All right, welcome back, everyone. Continuing work on Tuesday, March 11th. We are now diving into H321, our miscellaneous cannabis bill. Representative Boyd and I have spent a lot of time communicating with various stakeholders, building off the testimony that we have had formally at the table, and have asked that some new language be corrected as a result. So we have counsel here to run us through the words on the page, and then we're going to take a couple minutes to speak with JFO, and then again, it is control. So that's kind of like how we have things teed up for this portion. So with that.
Thank you.
Grace.
So for the record, Michelle Childs, Office of Legislative Counsel, and everyone should have a copy of draft 2.2 committee strike all amendment to H321. Don't worry if you didn't see 2.1 or 1.1 or 1.2. There are a few other ones there, but this is the first one I think that we're walking through the committee with. So what I did is I did do a strike all because there are a few different amendments, but I've highlighted the things that are different from the bill as introduced. So you should see those. But would you like me just to go through the highlighted portions or just do a quick walkthrough of everything just kind of as a reminder?
I think a quick walk.
Okay. Sure.
To get everybody's head back in.
Yep. So section 1, this is an amendment to existing law. You'll see that in an existing law, it says that cannabis that's possessed unlawfully in violation of the statutes that can be seized. And we're just adding a provision there that we're also talking about if it's in violation of administrative law as well, because you have authorized the board to adopt agency rules pursuant to what you've directed them to in statute. And those have the same force of law as statute. So we just want to be clear there. If you violate statute or rule, then your cannabis can be seized. Section 2 has to do with criminal background checks. So you recall this is something that you see every year in the miscellaneous cannabis bill of trying to find the sweet spot around criminal history record checks. You'll see the new language is just clarifying the board's authority to do fingerprint-based national criminal history record checks on each natural person prior to being issued an establishment identification card or a dispensary card. Section 3. This is language defining hemp products and hemp infused products. This is just truing it up with the language that you passed for hemp products in your miscellaneous cannabis bill last year. We updated the definition in Title VI, which is your agriculture title, and we just missed it over here for some reason. And so it's the same exact definition that you approved last year in Title VI. So page 3, section 4, this is your general rulemaking authority and directive to the board. The board has to adopt extensive administrative rules with regard to the operation of all cannabis establishments. You'll see in A1 that starts the language saying rules concerning any establishment. So that would apply to whether you're a cultivator or a processor or a wholesaler or a retailer. And then what's an existing law and all the things they have to adopt continues on page 4, on page 5, on page 6. And then you're adding a new one for rules concerning retailers that starts at the bottom of page 6. So you say rules concerning retailers, so specifically just for retailers. Currently, you have a requirement that they have to have rules on location or siting requirements that increase the geographic distribution of new retail operations. And this is changing it. So you'll see the language on page 7, line 3 is striking new. So it'd be distribution of cannabis retail establishments based on regional population, market needs, and community input. And the recommendation from your committee leadership on this was to have this replace. You'll recall in the bill as introduced, there was a provision at the end of the bill that established a retail moratorium for a certain period of time. And so this is intended to replace that. So you'll see later on when we get to the end of the bill, that section is no longer there, and the board will be adopting rules on how to kind of gauge the appropriate number of retail licenses. So continuing on page 7, subdivision 9. These are the requirements for the new rules for the new trim and harvest license. Remember, that's the kind of seasonal workers who are going to go on and help other licensees. Section 5, criminal background record checks. On page 8, there's the authority for the board to be able to follow up on do repeated record checks on someone. Subsection C has to do with the board being able to obtain record checks through third parties. And I think you've heard probably from Pepper and others around the kind of struggle with obtaining the national criminal history record checks from the feds. So just authorization there to get it outside of the federal system. Page 9. Section 6, and this is on the cannabis establishment identification cards. The language is on page 10. And subsection C, and this would allow the board to issue a temporary card because sometimes things can go a little slow with doing all of the background checks and the things that need to happen to be able to get that person onboarded. I think it's been an ongoing issue for some licensees that, if they have someone leave and they're trying to hire for the new hire, they want to get that person in place as soon as possible. This subsection C would allow them the board to issue a temporary permit for that person to serve as an employee of that licensee while they're completing the process. Section 7, this is all entirely new. You'll remember in the bill as introduced, there was a provision that kind of laid out an outline for receivership process for a licensee that was in trouble, essentially. If you had the owner who died or they went into bankruptcy or things like that, what do you do? Because now all of a sudden you have this entity that's licensed by the state and it has a lot of cannabis. And what are you going to do with it? How are you going to respond? And so I'll leave it up for the board to talk to you about their process and who they've talked to. I know they've been talking with other departments and agencies in the state as to the best approach. They've been talking to the court. And the language before you is their proposal. So you'll see starting at the top of page 11, subsection A addresses the purpose, which is to authorize the board to effectively oversee cannabis establishments and the people who oversee them in case of incapacity of a principal, dysfunction, operating distress, interruption in licensure, abrupt closure, or judicial intervention, including receivership. Subsection B sets forth that the board can issue a temporary special permit that authorizes either someone who's currently licensed with the board or someone who is not licensed currently, but they have been, the board has decided that they are a suitable person or entity to temporarily operate a cannabis establishment or to possess, transport, or dispose of cannabis and cannabis products as specified specifically by what's in that temporary permit. Subsection C is immunity from liability. So it's important to look at the lead-in language on that, which is on line 15. A person acting in conformity with the terms and the scope of a special permit that's issued by the board under this section receives civil and criminal immunity in relation to possession, transportation, or transfer of cannabis within the state of Vermont. So as long as they are operating within the scope of what they're allowed to do in that special temporary permit, they can't be charged, with cannabis possession, illegal cannabis possession, things like that. Page 12, subsection D. This allows for a process for the court to request that the board determine whether a person is suited by background and qualifications to hold a special permit. In the alternative, the court can ask the board to recommend a person. Okay. Section 8, this is the general provisions for the types of licenses. Currently, you have 7, but you're adding a new license type, which is the trim and harvest service license. So you see that addition on page 13. There's this just a notation on subdivision 3A. So you recall that under current law, you can only hold one of each type of license. So you couldn't have someone who has like 5 retail licenses. You know, they could have 1 cultivator, 1 retail, such like that. This is just clarifying that when you're talking about a trim and harvest service licensee, that they can provide services at multiple other licensees. So it doesn't mean that they have multiple licenses, but they may be serving a lot of different cultivators. So the next section starts on the bottom of page 14, section 9, and this is on the cultivator license. And so this has to do with the labeling on cannabis, and you'll see on D1D, which starts on line 8 of page 15. Right now, you have a requirement that you have a produced on date. And that's being changed to a harvested on date, reflecting the date that the cannabis was harvested. And that also has to include a packed on date, reflecting the date that the product was packaged for sale. Next section is bottom of page 15, section 10, the propagation cultivator license. You added those, I don't know, about maybe 2 years ago. And these are essentially kind of like nurseries. A nursery license. So people can grow little clones and they can sell them to other cultivators. And you'll see on page 16, subdivision A2, lines 4 and 5, this would also allow them to sell to retailers. So that way, if someone, because you do allow here in Vermont, someone to grow a few plants at home, if someone wants to be able to buy those little clones, those little small plants, starter plants, then they would be able to buy them potentially from a retailer. Section 11, this is your new trim and harvest service license. Just outlining that they can contract with cultivators on a seasonal or temporary basis to supply specified cannabis maintenance services within the scope of each client cultivator's license. Section 12 is the fee language. Page 17, you'll see on the first line on subdivision 8, the trim and harvest license has an annual fee of $500. The next 2 have been changed a little bit from the bill as introduced. Subdivision 9 applies to employees, and there's a $50 licensee fee per employee currently, and that's annual. And that was, in the bill as introduced, changed to a biennial fee. Now it has gone back to the annual fee, but there's new language there on lines 4 and 5, clarifying that the board shall offer 1-year and 2-year employee licenses. So you don't have to, so if you have somebody and they're kind of starting to be a longtime employee, even though the business is, relatively kind of new here, you don't necessarily have to go and do it every year. You can get a 2-year license for $100. Then on the products, which starts on line 6, that's gone back. Again, the bill is introduced, had to change it from an annual to a biennial. It's back to an annual. And then the same language that was in the bill is introduced, that the board can issue longer product registrations for certain products, and you do it on a prorated basis. So if you have something that's shelf stable and it doesn't need to be renewed every year, then you can do it for longer. Page 18, section 13. Oh, here I am again on bulk sales related to taxes, and I still don't know really what it does. So I'm going to let Ted talk to you about that. Sorry, Ted.
It's the
What I will say is my understanding is this is a technical, something that we should have caught probably in last year's or maybe the year before, maybe even the year before that. And somebody finally said, hey, can you include this? All right, page 19, sections 14 and 15. So you remember when I was here and I did the walkthrough, and I don't know how much you've talked about it since, but when, in 2020, when you passed the legislation, you set up a system, right? You have your taxes over here. You've got your excise tax, and that was to go to general fund. You have your sales tax, and that goes for, after school programming and things like that. Then you have your licenses and your fees and all that stuff. That would go into the Cannabis Regulation Fund. And the Cannabis Regulation Fund was intended to run the agency and all that you require them to do. It quickly became apparent that the licenses and fees and such that were going into the Cannabis Regulation Fund were nowhere near what was required to basically run the agency to do everything that you have required the agency to do. And so the legislature said, okay, well, we're going to divert the excise tax money from the general fund temporarily to the Cannabis Regulation Fund, because we're trying to get this agency off the ground. We've asked it to do a lot. And so we're going to temporarily move that money and then hope that it will stabilize. Any money that was left over that they didn't use would revert to the general fund. And so that's been going on for the last 2-3 years. And so it's supposed to revert back. Excise tax is supposed to revert back to the general fund this July 1st. The bill is introduced, got rid of that revert back provision. What you have in sections 14 and 15, which I realize are impossible to understand that that's what this does by looking at the language, but that's how we have to do it, is that this kicks it out a year. Okay, so instead of it reverting back to the general fund this July 1st, it would do so of July 1st of 2026. And last page 20, section 16. So there is the authorization for a new exempt enforcement attorney within the CCB. And that before was going to be for FY25, and now it's changed to FY26. And then on the effective dates, it was originally on passage, and now it's July 1st of this year.
Section 14, it says we fix and hold on a minute. Yeah, section E A1 says 2025. Should that be 2026? Transfer unexpended obligated amounts to Cannabis Regulation Fund to general fund close and does. Shouldn't that be 2026 fiscal year? It's 2025. What page is that? That is page 19. I think it's just maybe
Line 17.
Yeah, line 17.
I would have to ask my money people. I think, is it supposed to be different? I mean, I would kick it to Ted.
I
I don't do this, so just, yeah, I don't usually, we have a different attorney who does all the money stuff.
Yeah.
So, but
And we
thank
can
you for
just-
pointing it out, and we'll follow up.
We did just push our 230 with Douglas Farm with recent.
It doesn't match with the other dates.
No, I was having conversations on these provisions lately. So that's one of the reasons Any questions for council here? If not, we will shift it to JFO. So much.
For the record, Ted Barnett, Joint Fiscal Office. Those dates, just to start, are correct, even though they don't match. And I can talk more broadly about kind of the mechanics of how excise tax was allocated to the regulation fund and then made it to the general fund the past 2 fiscal years, and how it's envisioned to happen this upcoming fiscal year. and the budget construct. There is a document on the committee's webpage that talks a little bit about the mechanics of how the language in H321 fits within the current budget construct, or how it might kind of work at odds with current budget construct. I don't know, does the committee have witnesses share screens, or?
If you'd like to share the screen, feel free.
Sure, I can hop in the Zoom real quick. That will take a little time. Michelle did a great job of explaining kind of the mechanics of the excise tax revenue in fiscal year 24 and 25, and then how it's intended to work in fiscal year 26. And yes, so to kind of repeat what she said, the excise tax revenue, 14% excise tax revenue in fiscal years 24 and 25 were first allocated to the regulation fund, and then you're having fee revenue end up in the cannabis regulation fund, and the unexpended, unobligated balance at the fiscal year close was then allocated to the general fund in the following fiscal year. So that's why you're seeing that delay in dates, or that different in dates. So the language there refers to the unexpended, unobligated balance in fiscal year 25 would then be allocated July 31st in fiscal year 2026. So there's kind of a bit of that delay there. But let me share screen. So this is discussing what is proposed in the governor's recommended budget language for fiscal year 26, and it pertains to the allocation of fiscal year 25 cannabis excise tax revenue, which the consensus revenue forecast puts at $20.8 million. And so what this is saying is that the regulation fund in fiscal year 25 receives cannabis excise revenue, receives our fee revenue. It is paying for fiscal year 25 control board expenses. And then the fund is going to retain $4 million to pay for board expenses in fiscal year 26. That $4 million is net of the fee revenue that's expected in fiscal year 26. And so you have the residual amount that's left over after this. So you take your is anticipated to be $8.4 million. And that is from your fiscal year 25 cannabis excise tax revenue. Of that $8.4 million, 70% goes to the general fund, 30% goes to substance misuse programming. And in this language, the budgetary language gives a breakdown of that $8.4 million. $5.9 million goes to the general fund, 0.5 goes to substance misuse. This mechanic is designed to facilitate that transition from, in current law, excise tax revenues going to the regulation fund, and then in fiscal year 26 going to the general fund. And so in addition to this mechanic in fiscal year 26, the budget construct has the $8.4 million going to general fund, going to substance misuse from fiscal 25 revenues. They are also relying on 15.8 in available general fund revenue that's coming from overall fiscal year 26 excise tax revenues. If the language in 321 were to pass, that revenue would not be available to the general fund in fiscal year 26 because that transfer would happen in fiscal year 27. So you're creating, were this to pass, certainly a challenge for the appropriators because they were relying on that $15.8 million of available revenue. There would be some potential adjustments, right, to kind of account for that. But that's the central challenge there, is that this is already a complex allocation of revenues. And it is hard with the different retention of funds to kind of end up in the same place. So even if adjustments were made, I would have to sit down and kind of sit in an Excel spreadsheet to really know what the true impact were to be. The discussion also, yes, this makes my head hurt. It generally makes head hurts. I understand, heads hurt. The other piece I will mention is that the difference between having your excise tax revenue go to the general fund in fiscal year 26 versus go to the regulation fund has an impact on substance misuse funding, because the language under current law in fiscal year 26 takes all of your source excise tax revenue, so that's the full amount you collect, and allocates it 70% to the general fund, 30% to substance misuse. When you route it to the regulation first and pay for Cannabis Control Board expenses, that number is smaller compared to source revenue, because you're taking off the $6.5 million that would go to the control board, and then allocating that after fees would be more like 4 million. You're allocating that remaining revenue, 70% to the general fund, 30% to substance misuse. So that's also a piece of you're kind of working from two different numbers to do that allocation. So that is the challenge with the current cannabis funding structure. Wanted to introduce you to what it looks like in the budget construct. I totally understand that even after talking about it, it could be clear as mud. And so happy to answer any questions, happy to kind of go into it in more detail. But that is from JFO's perspective. The main challenge is that by keeping it in the regulation fund, it's just simply not available to the general fund in the same amount.
And we've had a bunch of conversations sort of around this for weeks now. Structure. So, right now, just understanding better. So I personally comfortable knowing that this bill has to go to Ways and Means and Appropriations. And just removing that language, going back to the status quo and letting them have the conversations at the. So that's just where I was at as representative.
Thank you. So what would you eliminate or you strike out of the bill or change?
We would just be removing sections 14 and 15, was it? I keep wanting to say 13 and 14. 14 and 15, correct. It's the highlighted sections.
And does that affect at all how we worded our budget? Support letter, because we talked about the transfers.
No, because the bill as introduced did strike these sections, these provisions. Is that correct?
The bill is introduced, and I'll point to Michelle here just to confirm that I'm saying correctly, deleted kind of the session log allocations and would have extended the regulation fund retention kind of indefinitely of excise tax revenues.
So it's the opposite.
Mhm.
Bill introduces opposite of what you'd be doing if you just took the sections.
So I think in its rawest explanation, what we're doing right now is we're going to remove these sections, maintain the status quo, and let conversation. So we're just removing these sections. My recommendation that these sections just be removed for the time being. Because I get I understand the perspective of JFO about fraud in the dollars the full year.
So we're talking 14, 15?
Yes, those two highlighted sections. Representative thing.
Thanks. So at the very bottom of your analysis, you are talking about the enforcement attorney.
Mhm.
So I was under the impression in conversation that any fees collected would cover the cost of another attorney. But I'm reading this and it does not say that to me. So how could I be assured that is correct or not?
So, yes, the $150,000 is information provided by the control board. It is not contained within the governor's recommend kind of budget proposal from the control board. So either they would need to find kind of resources within that existing spending authority if the budget were to pass, or have an appropriation from either the regulation fund if it were to come from fees, or the general fund if it were to kind of pursue another option. But there would need to be some sort of appropriation to give them the spending authority on top of what they currently have within their budget request.
Further, we did not specify this in our was bias or.
No, I think this is just like a kind of. We have this just understanding the bill more. Right now, we have plenty of time this week.
And you'll often see like in a budget, within the budget, right, you'll have a position authorized, and then within kind of the agencies or the department's kind of budget request, the funding is provided for that position. And since this is kind of traveling independently within a miscellaneous bill, you just have to adjust. I have some additional, I can follow up on what Michelle mentioned about the language that kind of the Department of Taxes. Yes. Requested. So yes, that's just adding in that provision, it requires entities that transfer to notify the Department of Taxes if they're collecting trust taxes. So this is our sales and use tax or meals and rooms tax. And so Chapter 207 refers to cannabis excise and sales tax. And so just needed to include that to ensure that when a business transfers, they're notifying the Department of Taxes that there's kind of a new entity that's going to be collecting and retaining the tax. So yes, primarily a technical change, but that's kind of the context on that piece. And then yes, for other fiscal impacts, just wanted to note that the control board noted that fewer than 10 establishments are expected to apply for your harvest and trim license. And so minimal additional revenue coming from that license. And then the difference in kind of having longer term employee or product licensing fees may mean, right, that you're seeing if more people are doing 2 years up front, you might see a little bit of choppiness in the revenues that are accruing from those fees, but it's not changing the amount that's collected in the long term. So wanted to note that for the committee.
I just wanted to say, I was looking at the as introduced, and it's section 17 is what calls for the one full-time permanent position, temp position. If you look at the as introduced bill, which is 23 pages compared to the 20.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm just trying to figure out why we did not talk about that in our budget discussion.
I don't remember talking about it in the budget discussion.
Simply not. So.
Anything else for JFL right now? All right. Thank you very much, Ted. We appreciate that analysis and the hard work you do.
Of course. And yeah, anyone can feel free to grab me if they want to talk cannabis excise tax.
Yeah.
Stimulating hard.
Yeah.
Up next, folks, I would like to invite David to kind of run down the changes that are on.
Thank you, committee, for having me. I'll try to be brief. I'm Gabe Gilman from the Cannabis Control Board. I'm the board's general counsel. I'll focus as we run through on the changes that are new in this draft. If you have other questions, by all means, please feel free to interrupt or to pose those. The first of and possibly the most important of the changes is found at the top of page 7, an addition to the board's rulemaking mandate that slightly modifies instructions given to the board last year to develop location or siting requirements that increase the geographic distribution of new cannabis retail establishments based on population, market characteristics, and whatnot. This change instructs the board, in addition, to take community input and to consider regional population. What we had cooked up on the old instructions was very focused on individual municipalities. This ties in importantly to concerns expressed by retailers in your previous meeting on this bill about instability in the retail market and their desire to have some stability and a pause. The practical effect of this amendment, in addition to broadening the scope of things that the board is to consider and must consider when it promulgates a rule, is it is going to make it a practical certainty that the board will not be able to adopt the rule for 18, possibly 24 months. That means that the retailer's concerns are getting taken care of as a matter of administrative necessity, really, just because we need that time. By way of background, I have this administrative rule open now. It actually just finished its notice and comment period, meaning I've got to go get one through to LCAR, post it, get everybody used to it, come up with the new reopen rulemaking for this project. So that gives you a sense of the calendar. And we need that time. I think the board has just, as I talked about in my previous testimony, board just contracted with consultants to give us some market analysis. So we need that time, clearly going to take that time. Want to be really clear on the record that that's going to be an 18-month project to 24 months on the bad end. I know some people are nervous. How do we know that? And I have a 15-year track record as an administrative lawyer, never adopting a rule faster than anybody expected. So that won't happen this time. Turning to the rest of the changes, they're fairly minor. There was a change to Section 7 that we talked about from the bill as originally introduced. This was the section about special permitting. Michelle Childs gave such a thorough introduction to this that I don't feel like I need to go back through it. It's just meant to address problems that have come up for the board when licensees were suddenly interrupted. In many states, in part because there is no federal bankruptcy protection for these entities, there also is a need for the regulator to interact with receiverships ordered by the judiciary. So this sort of attempts to kill two birds with one stone there, giving the board general special permitting authority to deal with those unusual circumstances when there's no licensed person to take custody of cannabis, or often sometimes to transport it from a place where it is to a place where it can be. As well as, if called upon by the judiciary, to respond by assisting them with screening folks for their suitability as a possible receiver or permit holder. There are no changes to the trim team language, so I won't talk about that unless there are questions. Turning to the amendments to section 910, those are meant to do what Sam Bellavance, who was here before from industry, had requested, extending the duration of time a licensee can have when a product is registered. It used to be every single year you had to come back. Now there would be an opportunity to have a longer 2 or 3 year registration of products based upon their characteristics and their shelf stability. And to do a similar thing with employees. Had been under existing law, you've got to register them every year. This would allow a business to choose, much like you do with your car registration, would I like to pay for 1 year or just 2 years and not have to think about this again for 24 months. I think that's uncontroversial, sort of a common sense thing to do. The change is because we accidentally merged everybody's solutions into one, and we effectively cut the cost by writing biennial. It was never intended to be, it was always meant to be revenue neutral. The cost per day of each of these is not meant to change, never really was. So just a technical correction there is what you said. So if you have any other questions, happy to take them. Otherwise, I know you're busy.
So it seems like big conversation right now. So,
Thank you for coming.
thank you very much, sir. So it seems that, all right, so what's the feeling on Which is basically the mechanism by which. We've done some like back and forth with things because things. This is trying to just stabilize the flow of dollars. Excise, is dropping it on. How the excise tax delivers money. Trying to do right now, trying that there's no. Dollars because right now, there seems to be a mechanism within the language that creates a 1-year mark where it does not get delivered for a period of time. So it essentially winds up in stock on the back end. It's delivered. And I know.
Pretty, yes, pretty good. Yes. That was good. Yes, and I don't really have anything additional to add except to note that yes, the budget construct really relies on that number that shows up as available in the consensus revenue forecast, and by holding on to that revenue for an additional year, essentially, yeah, it just creates.
That was the part I was missing with the consensus. We're close enough. And that's the thing, it's super complicated, it's a bigger conversation. So I think, back to previous conversations, given clock, they are aware that this bill is coming to them, they are aware that they're gonna have several conversations about how dollars happen. So, cool. Representative Collin.
Just for clarification for me, when we're talking about voting this out of committee, when we do move it out of committee, when you're saying for sections 14 and 15, removing them,
Yes.
are they for removing them, then they'd have to put them back in when this goes back to the,
Or find
Or
a
do we-
different like solution to this.
or do we vote it so that we can ask to move it to Ways and Means so they can look at these two sections? We can approve it up to section 14 and then let them look at the rest of this.
And
leave it in
the
there.
mechanism.
Yeah, how does that mechanism
like
work?
that. So like basically the process, like this has been flagged for conversation.
Okay.
Planning committees, so for the bills to vote out a clean bill, recommendation is to remove this language so they can consciously address it
Okay,
once they take possession of the bill, because when we vote this out, it's gonna go to Ways and Means. And then once they're done handling, it's gonna go. So this bill still has 2 more stops on the train before it hits.
okay, I just was trying to get clarification on it because it's different for me. So.
No, that's a great question. And so like the recommendation would be to just hold this, remain with the status quo we have right now. And let the Ways and Means Committee and the Appropriations Committee have this conversation. Because they're used to like, the vocabulary and mechanisms all within this.
Okay.
All right, so that seems like an amenable approach, folks, yes. All right. Cool, and then let's talk about this staff position while we have time.
Section 16, 17.
16, 17, that'd be
That's the last page.
Mhm.
one full-time exempt position, but here. Was that a hand or a scroll?
No, it was
That
a
just a
dramatic
vigorous scroll.
icons.
Okay.
Movement.
So this would be, and I'm just thinking out loud. So this would be something that would have to be approved as a new position. Right?
Yes.
This is not currently in the governor's budget recommend. We did not include it on our memo.
We did not have it on our radar.
Yeah. So,
That's really hard. I find that really hard when we don't even know it's coming, so we can't comment on it.
Do you remember that they popped up with? We just had so many emails and stuff coming through, like different conversations, like the email chains on this bill was very intense. So. The question around this is all around. Enforcement attorney and something like that. I mean, this is all sort of just like the overseeing of the operators on compliance level, right? So my understanding is they're doing more of this work in the field. Now that we have like a firmer footing a couple of years into it. So. You'd like to offer us a little bit more insight on the needs of this? Yeah, from a safety perspective.
So still Gabe Gilman from the Cannabis Control Board. This position would be only the second attorney position in the entire agency. I'm the only lawyer the agency has right now. There are a couple of reasons that we think this, makes operational sense and may actually not create the expenditure to the state that one would think. The first is that as a procedural necessity, it's just very, very difficult to, with a single lawyer, run an agency that has a quasi-judicial functions. That is to say that it has contested cases almost in a semi-judicial function where people with due process rights come before the agency. There needs to be someone from the agency with appropriate training to run the hearing in a kind of prosecutorial sense and to state what has happened as an advocate for, some kind of violation or sanction for somebody who has committed a violation, or to defend the integrity of the licensing process if somebody has tried to obtain a license for which they're not qualified. The general counsel's role is really to set up the machine, to do the policy stuff and to set up the hearing process so that it is fair. Without a second person with legal training to present enforcement cases and to act sort of as the, administrative prosecutor, it puts people like me in the agency in a very strange position where we're sort of making the rules and trying to keep the forum neutral and fair, and also acting as an advocate for the prosecution, if you will. And then there's just the practicalities of numbers. We have thousands of registrants between the people with medical cards, providers, employees. Then we have hundreds of licensees. At this point, I think we have 4 active or 5 active appellate matters right now, and I'm the only person to deal with them. We do get assistance in the judiciary from the Attorney General's office, so I don't want you to think I have to go all the way through the Supreme Court. But when you have to write 4 or 5 appellate briefs in a month and then try to get you guys stuff on time, it's not a very effective method. Additionally, because this is an enforcement attorney and our enforcement actions are revenue generating, some part of this position would be offset by increased fine revenue. Not all of it coming from Vermont businesses. Our agency has jurisdiction to deal, for example, with the purveyors of hemp-derived beverages from out of state. One of the things I think we're really proud of is keeping them off of gas station shelves in Vermont. But we can bring administrative actions against folks who are doing that, but we need the horsepower to do it. So in many cases, it's a certainty we would bring in more fine revenue. I can't make representations to you about that paying for the whole position. I don't think it's true in the first year, but they would certainly be offset. But it's more as a practical matter in order to run the kind of due process shop and have fair hearings that we owe Vermonters who have been accused of violations. This is really helpful. So that's why we're sort of where we are.
Tim Burnett, Director of Office, yes, and wanted to comment that JFO doesn't make any estimates into increased revenue from fines, just as context. So the position we would kind of estimate as being the $150,000 cost. But yes, it is certainly possible with fines flow to the general fund, right? And so there could be revenue there, but we don't make any estimate as to the magnitude of that.
About the zero compliance. So as you're doing more work within the compliance dynamic, actual application, like now going in and checking in on different locations, whether retailers, are you doing some compliance checks on cultivators now? Well, I know they started with retail. And just to move on, could you just give us an understanding of how that's going and
Yes, I mean, I'm glad you raised that as well. We're really kind of in a mission shift. When the agency started up, its mission was to get, black market cultivators, entrepreneurs, everybody who wanted in the gate at the beginning, get them vetted, get them in fast, welcomed in, oriented, trained, and licensed in a manner that was compliant, and to do it by October. And they did that really, really fast. Once that group of people that definitely wanted in the market were in, the agency has really shifted to an enforcement focus. At this point, our pool of licensees is pretty stable. And what we need to do is set expectations among them about compliance, try to create the culture that we want and hope for, of fair play and compliant conduct by our licensees, both with respect to the competition among them, and the way they interact with their communities and the hazards and externalities that sometimes are created when they do. So we've had that kind of mission shift. We used to be in licensing that was heavy on administrative staff and not very heavy on legal staff. We're now into a lot more focus on things that implicate the due process rights of individual Vermonters and business owners, for which we must have this hearing capacity. We didn't used to have a lot of hearings. Now we do, is another way of saying it.
so basically the request is responsibility.
It's, in our view, necessary to meet the growing demand, predictably growing, naturally growing demand to carry more cases. At the beginning, we didn't have any of those. We just had new licensees. And
All right, any other questions for Gabe while we got him right there? Oh, all right, thank you very much, sir.
thank you.
The other pieces that anybody might want to discuss right now on this. Love to give us our next bucket of fairness. And thank you all for your help.
No, just in 5 minutes.
Yeah, we can come back, I'm gonna give us 15 minutes. And then we're gonna come back at 2:55 to start with the conversation around 397.